Good afternoon, everyone. I think we're finally ready to start. Thank you so much for your patience. Okay, so for those who don't know me, I'm Bruna Boscaini. I'm the director of IRMO, and I have the pleasure to open today's event. But before I start, I just want to go through some very basic fire safety and housekeeping instructions. In case you hear the fire alarm, we should all make an exit through this door over here, the same one that you came through. If there's anything blocking this exit, you also have an exit at the back and another one here on that side over there. And it's all very well signed, so you should have no trouble. Toilets are at the back as well, through the doors that I would say are blue or gray or perhaps black. But it's the only door at the back, so you cannot get that wrong. Okay, and then please also remember to put your mobile phones on silence, and that's only so we have no interruptions during the presentations. Okay, so, well, it's a pleasure to welcome you all here to the launch of our legal briefing on the right to education for migrant children in England. This initiative was commissioned by IRMO and written by Jen N, that is here in front with us. Jen is a human rights lawyer and the founding director of Law Manatee. And this brief tackles a very important issue that affects many children in our communities, and I guess that's why we have so many of you here today. We're very, very excited to be sharing this work with you all, and I want to also extend my heartfelt thank you to our funders, the Paul Hamlin Foundation, for enabling this work. Also, a big thank you to Jen, that has so generously shared her expertise and her passion with us through this work. We feel very lucky that we got to collaborate with you, Jen, and to our panelists that are here to join us today, and will be properly introduced in a second by my colleague, Karen. And I also want to recognize the incredible work of our team at IRMO, whose dedication continues to drive our mission every day, and today is a great example of that. Special thank you, thinking about IRMO, to our children and young people team, past and present. We can see how much they give to our community day to day, and we see that it's through this work that we're able to produce a piece such as the one that we are presenting, and that's extremely valuable. And I have another special mention to make, and that goes to Elia, who's very well hidden there at the back. Of course, we have to mention you today, Elia. So Elia is one of the founders of IRMO, and she's the person that was behind the beginning of what our Children Union People area is today. That was back in the 80s, so you can see that we've been working this for a long time, because we have so much work ahead of us. So thank you so much, Elia, for being here. It's very special to have you with us. And, well, finally, definitely, I want to express our gratitude to the children, young people, and families that have trusted us to support us and have shared their experience, and through them we've been able to build this work that we're presenting. I will now just speak very briefly about IRMO, so you can learn a little bit more about who we are. So IRMO, for the last 40 years has been led by and for the Latin American community, building deep ties and trust across the UK as we fight for a future where everyone can access their rights, live free from poverty and discrimination, and pursue their aspirations without barriers. So everything we do, from our frontline service to our advocacy work, aims to enable the development, agency, and participation of all Latin Americans, and also Portuguese and Spanish speakers, migrants, including asylum seekers and refugees. We provide wraparound support that is tailored to the specific needs of the individuals and families that we support. And of course, that includes from high quality advice service to also development opportunities for all ages. It's important to mention that through our service, we are definitely looking for long-term social and systemic change, and we believe that what we are presenting to you today is a very special advance of our efforts in this area. So I encourage everyone to take part, like an active part in our discussion, and I just want to thank you very much for being here today.
just to carry on, I would like to first welcome you all to this space. Thank you for bearing with me as I sent you a million emails, but clearly they worked because you're all here. And yes, it's very moving to see that everyone here has this common interest of advocating for the rights of migrant children to education. So just a quick overview of what our agenda will look like today. We will start off with the introduction that Bruna just gave, and then I will present Thrive, the project under which this legal briefing falls, and then Jen will take over to give us a presentation of the report and the key findings. We will then have a Q&A and then a coffee break, a short 10-minute coffee break, and then we will have our panel discussion followed by a final Q&A. So that's just a quick overview. So to start off by presenting Thrive. So Thrive is a project at IRMO that is focused on education advocacy. And the whole goal of Thrive is to reduce structural barriers that prevent Latin American and migrant children from accessing education. Thrive aims to ensure equal access to education regardless of immigration status, language barriers, cultural or social differences, or ability. To give you a quick overview of the different priorities, I guess, under Thrive. We have our first priority, which is to influence migration and education system reform through research and partnerships with schools, legal experts, and policymakers, which is what we're doing here today. We also want to improve access to support services for children and families. We want to strengthen civic participation by training parents and carers to advocate for their children's rights and engaging with local authorities and policymakers. And finally, we want to inform public understanding through research and advocacy. A key outcome of this work is the legal brief that we're here to discuss today. As Bruna mentioned, it was commissioned by IRMO and was funded generously by the Paul Hamlin Foundation, and it critically examines the legal framework surrounding education rights for migrant children in the UK, drawing on over a decade of experience from IRMO working with Latin American families and offering recommendations for reform. As you might have seen from the report, we draw on real-life examples of casework, and the idea in working with Jen was to be able to take these practical examples that we see over and over at IRMO and try and approach it from a more structural policy change perspective. So without further ado, I am honored to introduce Jen Ann, the author of this brief. Jen is a human rights lawyer and activist committed to making the law more equitable for all. She is the founding director of Lawmanity, which works with people-led movements to address legal inequalities and drive positive change. Jen specializes in immigration and asylum law, violence against women and girls, children's rights, and the rights of survivors of torture and trafficking. She has co-founded Just Right Scotland, a human rights charity that uses legal strategies to challenge structural barriers and promote equality. Jen is also a professor in practice at the School of Law at the University of Glasgow, and she is qualified to practice law in Scotland, England, Wales, and New York. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Jen to the stage.
It's lovely to see you all. You have to give me a minute to get my slides up in front of me so I don't keep turning around to look back. And I was just saying to my colleague Clare at the start that I'm horrified to see that you've all started flicking through the report. I managed to sort of put out of my mind until this moment that you would be doing that. Much as this has been an incredible project, and I'm totally honoured to have been able to work with IRMO. So what I thought I would do today is not deliver like a webinar on the substantive content of the entire report, but speak to you a little bit about why we did it and what we aim to achieve, and maybe a little bit as well about how we hope people will use it. And because I see, the attraction of doing this work was always about working with an organization, buy-in for a community, and specifically tailoring something that was about the biggest challenges that their clients face. So if we can go over the page. Okay, perfect. So the challenge as we stepped into this was the following. So IRMO has, over the past 10 years, supported 1,500 Latin American children and young people into education or to access school or college. And I'm sure that the number of further people who, through signposting and support, have benefited is wider. But the troubling thing is actually for an organization that does casework in a migrant community, and the Latin American community is not the only community that faces this. The troubling thing is that this level of advocacy and casework support is required at all, particularly when children's rights and the principle of equal access to education is internationally one of the areas where we should see the greatest consensus. Looking at how we are falling short in the UK, I think these might actually be REUK figures, but there's an average attainment gap for unaccompanied asylum-seeking pupils and not an attainment gap between unaccompanied asylum-seeking pupils and non-migrant children of over 3 years. And actually that's similar to the gap that you would see for pupils with special needs and disabilities who have the most severe needs. And if you think about that statistic for a while, that is just because of the circumstances of their arrival and then the barriers to their accesses to services here in England. The gap for resettled refugee children and asylum-seeking children and families narrows a little bit. It's slightly less at, it's 17.3 months, it should say, and not years at GCSE level. But again, we're just thinking about the principle of equal access, equal treatment, and what we're seeing is that on average, children, because of particular circumstances, in this case migration status, are falling behind. I should also say, if we go over the page, that IRMO does work UK-wide, and you may have noted that I primarily practice in Scotland, although I did practice in England for 5 years. And one of the things that's interesting about this piece of work, because of where the young people that Thrive mostly supports, because they sit in England, I focused mainly on the laws, the education laws in England, and also the particular challenges here. However, in the framework section, I also wrote a bit about devolved educational authorities and also some examples from other jurisdictions of other work that has been done. And I think that that's a useful thing to bear in mind, because there are opportunities at times to maybe have a strategic litigation dialogue between different jurisdictions, and that's something that I tried to suggest here. So the purpose of the report was twofold: to set out the legal rights of migrant children and young people, focusing mainly on England, as I said, but also to support the Thrive team to explore legal and policy advocacy strategies to challenge those structural barriers beyond casework, advocacy, and litigation. And that is really a recognition which I think you all know, because you are doubtless more specialist in various areas than I am in some of these issues. That's because you will know that we are supporting children and young people in an uneven legislative and policy environment, which is very unfair, very unequal in some ways. So whilst I'm a lawyer and I've been written to write a legal briefing to support the confidence, but also to increase the outreach of the human rights information in this area, I also worked with the team to think more broadly about other strategies for achieving change, and you will see that in the report as well. So we go. Okay. So how the report is laid out. As Karen was speaking to you earlier, I was keen the approach we took was to work from actual IRMO case studies, and the brief was also to provide something that is practical and accessible. There is a short fact sheet which I can't take credit for, which Karen drafted, and the aspiration over time is to turn pieces of this into sort of bite-sized resources, or to use them to work with the families that the IRMO Thrive project support. Now, those of you in the room who are specialists or lawyers will know that lawyers have extreme reluctance and a lot of difficulty in taking highly accurate but very complex, sort of phrased areas of law and drawing them into language that is correct and also accessible. But you'll see when you sort of flick through the report, the intended audience, I suppose, is for this to be usable by frontline advisors, but also by parents, or to be transformed further into materials that perhaps the Thrive project families can use to co-produce other materials. So it was very much about what are you facing now, and actually what is the sort of legally relevant information we can provide to help you shape sort of your next move. As I said before, there is also a piece of work which I'm going to come back to do with the Thrive project team, which is looking through the report, working with them on what they will be prioritizing over the next few years of the Thrive project. And I think one more reflection here perhaps is I do think, and this is very much a dialogue or a starting point. I fully expect that in a couple of years' time, I would love to see what the team has done with this, but I also expect that challenges move and change, right? So it could be that today, these are the issues that we're facing, but there could be a happy event like legislative or policy change, but there could also be different challenges arising depending on future flows of migration and so on. Okay, so let's take a closer look. Oh yes, this is my favorite point to make. So, as you will have heard through the materials and in my introduction, this project is at its heart a very human rights-based approach. I think that it's really easy for us to use those words human rights and sort of forget actually what they imply. And that's because when you're working with marginalized communities, you're very often, almost always in the position of asking for something. So can I please have, could you please look at this decision again? And we quickly forget that one of the strengths of the law and a rule of law system and the strengths of the principle of human rights is that actually rights inhere in people. So the people we're working for, they actually do or they should have rights that they are claiming as opposed to a benefit that they are asking for. And I do think that gets lost, and I think we sometimes step away from that as well, because when we do engage in human rights education information, we quickly raise expectations, and then there's a gap between the rights that people think or know they have and actually their lived experience of a system that is sort of persistently unequal, right? But I do think that if we give up on that rights language, we lose quite a lot, actually. We lose a principle, and we lose a principle that present and future generations should be able to refer to. So I'm quite keen, and have been keen in practice as well, to refer to or raise human rights arguments, even when they're not welcome. so even when they're not recognized, even when in some cases they're not justiciable in the way that you would like them to be, I think it's still useful to remind public authorities that people have these rights, and also that some of the policy that public authorities are supposedly seeing out are meant to be upholding rights, and I think we forget that quite a lot. So our expectation of fair process, or our expectation of inclusive and accessible materials, that is linked to international human rights that purportedly the UK government and by extension local authorities are upholding. So you see at the front of the report, there is a piece about the international legal human rights framework. There are a few pieces of relevant litigation, but also very quickly a recognition that what we're working with is the UK legislation, which I also highlight. But that is an important piece. So I have just on the slide a reminder that no people should be denied the right to education, which is Article 2 of Protocol 1. And also, and this will be familiar again to the lawyers in the audience, but maybe something that isn't emphasized enough to everyone else, that Article 14 of the European Convention of Human Rights gives everyone the right to enjoy all of the other rights free from discrimination. Okay? And we can forget that because, again, that is not our experience of how rights are claimed and accessed in the world. But technically, if you have a sort of an absolute right, or you have a clear right, it should be the case that everyone in the UK is accessing that right equally free from discrimination on a range of grounds. Okay, I'm gonna hold back from the lawyer thing, which is to then give you all of the cards, all of the caveats. So it's a right to education, but not all education. But I think that's the starting point. And I also will say that if you are an advocate or a caseworker or a parent, not only is that the starting point, but you should probably just open with that and let the other person tell you if they think there's a reason why you deserve anything less, or your child deserves anything less than equal right to education in this context. That's a legitimate way to kind of frame what the right looks like. And then just to add a little bit of flavor, because we do know, I'm telling you about this equal right to education, but you do know that there are a lot of problems in accessing that. The European Court of Human Rights has considered a string of cases around exclusion from education on the basis of nationality or migration status. But it is really quite clear that only very strong considerations will allow a state to agree that it's fair to exclude people from education on those bases. So that's the kind of start with the bold right? And then be prepared to listen. And then you'll see this because I'm quite practical all the way through. Of course, if anyone ever tells you no, make sure you get them to tell you in writing, right? get the explanation in writing. Okay, if we move over the page again. Okay. So this is a bit of a longer conversation as I work through the bullet points, and it is to explain how we got to where we got to in the rest of the briefing. So I think again, looking across the crowd today, you're all really interested in this area of law and probably very experienced in many cases in case working in advocacy. So you will know very well that the UK hostile environment links migration status to entitlement to many kinds of public services. So, we start with international human rights, these very bold universal rights, which should be enjoyed free from discrimination of any kind. But our lived reality, and it's one that we see in the press, but we actually feel in our day-to-day lives, is that in many areas of our lives, so in access to work, and in forms of education benefits and lots of other places, we're being asked about our migration status, our nationality, in order to assess, again, our eligibility for things. Okay, and this has quite, as a policy, it has an intentionally sort of fragmenting impact on our communities, and it affects all of us, as you know, because the right to ask any one person about their right to be here affects the security or the sense of belonging of all of us, right? And this is the backdrop, it's the backdrop in which we have to understand sort of this struggle for equal rights for migrant children and young people in education. So this leads to a few different things. First, there is legal exclusion, which is to say in some areas, particularly when you get to further and higher education, there are entitlements, or there are aspects of funding. There are things that you legally cannot access because of your migration status. Okay? So there are areas where there is under 18, over 16, you have that challenge, but you also have contradictory legal rights and obligations. And I'm going to explain what I mean by that. And this is basically, these are the areas where lawyers would say that there's something there that could be litigated, which is to say, on the one hand, you have these broad universal rights, but on the other hand, in practice, you have practices that are possibly unlawful. But the way that law and policy progresses is that the state or public authority will try something, and very often will continue to sit successfully in the trying if they are unchallenged. And that is confusing for people, because what you have is something in practice that isn't reflecting your expectation of what that sort of bold, bright line law is. So I'll give you an example maybe to make that a bit more concrete. So you could presume that if there's universal access to primary education in the UK, or if that is the aspiration, that actually any child who comes to the UK should be able to access some form of education, sort of straight away. That feels okay. That feels about right? But actually, in practice, as we know, there are not only barriers. There are actually children who, by virtue of their migration status, and there is a table, are not entitled to enroll, for example, and that is confusing because it suggests that there is a lawful exclusion, which is yet also unlawful in some ways, right? And so contradictory legal rights and obligations are also harmful because it sort of adds to this snowball of confusion that everyone has, but that crucially that parents and schools and communities might have about where rights and entitlements lie. I think I'll just say here about contradictory legal rights and obligations, I just want to share a little bit of history that some of you may know about, and it's just to kind of drive home this point. So I don't know how many of you have looked at or know about the history of the UK's relationship with the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. Some of you probably, right? So the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child is an international human rights treaty. It's one of the most widely ratified treaties in the world, which is to say that most people agree, most people are quite happy actually, with the idea that there are a list of rights that all children should have. And the UK did ratify this treaty in 1991. But when it did, it ratified it subject to some reservations. And does anyone know what one of the reservations was? So,
Prison.
pardon?
Was one about imprisoning children?
Yes. And there was another, so that's exactly right. So there was another. What else? Okay. So, so a state can enter into a reservation, which means that I agree to be bound by this piece of legislation, but not this part. So it's like you join a club and you say, I'll join the club, but except for these rules, right? And then we can do this because states enter into treaties voluntarily, right? So the other reservation in 1991 was in relation to children's entry, stay, and departure, where they're subject to immigration control. So the UK actually said, we agree to uphold the rights of all children except migrant children. I'm just going to let that settle for a second. It's quite chilling, isn't it? I did look into and was asked at one stage, I did look into why that reservation was entered into, and apparently there was a discussion at the House of Lords level, if you're interested, and it was out of a fear, this is interesting, it's out of a fear that parents would send their children ahead of them to the UK as like an anchor, and then apply for family reunion, something which is still not really very possible unless you litigate it. But that fear was totally unevidenced, meaning this was raised in the House of Lords as this is why we should enter into this reservation, right? But with no actual proof that this was going to be a problem. But what's really kind of, for those of us who are immigration lawyers, what's really troubling is that from 1991 until 2008, so this was corrected in this was corrected in a subsequent sort of piece of legislation, immigration legislation. From 1991 until 2008, it was not possible to use the full force of the UNCRC, which is not actually fully justiciable in England, but like for migrant children. And so if we ask ourselves, why do people think, coming back to education and the hostile environment, why do people think migrant children are somehow entitled to less? Well, one of the reasons, sort of quite sinister, is that, you know, for a period of time, for a long period of time, that is not only, you know, something that the government sort of made us feel, right? They actually were able to stand in an international, in a global community, and say, actually, our need to exclude children subject to immigration control is greater than our need to just guarantee that they'll be treated equally. Okay, so that was a little piece about contradictory legal rights and obligations, but I just wanted to say that to you. And I also wanted to say, certainly in my work in Scotland, in social work practice, I still run across social workers who were trained in that time. And so there's something to unwind there as well. Like you can update them, you can tell them since 2009. The Home Office also required to take the best interests of the children into account. And that actually I think it's relatively settled now that despite these pieces of hostile environment legislation, you should be able to raise the argument that the UNCRC also requires non-discrimination, certainly in other areas like education and health for migrant children. Okay, so the third bullet point just says misinformation, which I don't need to elaborate for you, and I do think this is because of the hostile environment. The immigration system has created such a complex network of different migration status that it is a challenge in education, but also in health and in social care and everywhere else, in housing, right? For people to actually know what is the right thing to do or what someone is entitled to, right? So misinformation is an issue for everyone, but particularly for professions, and it probably has cost different statutory agencies quite a lot of money in terms of trying to ensure that their workers are adequately supported. And this changes all the time. So just to give you an example, you will even know that over the last 3 or 4 years, we've had changes in status for European citizens, and then we had the Ukraine schemes, and the entitlements work differently. So that's like a really concrete example of like what is the challenge for people who are trying to do the right thing, but you know, are going to find it difficult to keep up because they're not specialists. The next thing is a legitimate fear of accessing services, and that was referenced earlier, and I think you'll probably all be familiar with this. But beyond the misinformation, you'll find that people and families who do have rights and entitlements may not access services because of previous experience of having given information to one statutory authority and having it passed to the Home Office, or because of what's being said around the community, which is that no matter who tells you that it's safe to do this, it's not. And then the last 3 bullet points are just prejudice and discrimination. So we can't ignore the fact that beyond laying out the law and policy clearly, there are times where we just see illegal exclusion, gatekeeping, and the operation of prejudice. And if you need to ask yourself, how can we know that? All you need to do is look at the difference in figures, not just in migrant access to education, but say in presentation of homelessness applications, between someone doing it themselves and someone doing it with a caseworker, right? And if there is quite a large disparity, one of the reasons is that other factors like prejudice, discrimination, and gatekeeping are also happening. And I think we saw that as well in how effective the Thrive casework and advocacy is. So the cases that they work on are maybe a bit more complex and ultimately with a high degree of success. But what we're also seeing is just the application of the extra hours and hours and weeks of people's time necessary to unlock what usually will be conceded in the end as a lawful request for a right of access. So all in all, we're doing this in an environment where there's a clear gap between the values that we express and actually what people are experiencing in practice. Okay, I'll take on. I promise there are not so many more. That was the long thinky piece. Okay, so for example, yeah, okay. So I've just pulled like 3 or 4 examples now from the report to explain what I mean, and then I'll wrap up and let you on with your lives. So for example, it is clear in DFE guidance that primary schools must not check immigration status on enrollment, and they mustn't deny children a place or remove them from the school roll if they suspect that child does not have the right to study. That's more or less a lift from the guidance. And that's good, okay? But the issue in practice is that the Thrive team were seeing families who had been asked to furnish things like show us your boarding pass in order to come to the UK, or tell us about your immigration status, which is not reassuring. And there may be reasons for that, but it's not reassuring, and it sits uncomfortably with the guidance. But beyond that, and in the guidance itself, schools are also told that they can tip off families they suspect to be living illegally in the UK to the Home Office, and then there's a little bit that tells them how to do it. And this sits sort of paragraphs apart. So I spoke about this sort of contradiction between our values and then what happens in practice. So schools are told, don't do this, but then they're also told, but you are permitted to. Like, you could if you suspected that a family was here lawfully. And then, of course, some of you who have been in practice longer, although 2015 doesn't feel that long ago, will remember that in 2015, the Department for Education and the Home Office entered into a memorandum of understanding. And does anyone remember what that was about? Does anyone here, like old school education? So that memorandum of understanding in 2015 was an agreement for the DFE to share up to 1,500 individual children and families' details with the Home Office per month. Okay, per month. That was up to 1,500 per month, right? The reason for that memorandum, and this was sort of in the heady days of, the hostile environment. Basically, this was the Home Office testing the boundaries of their ability to use schools for immigration enforcement. The reason for this basically was to use school enrollment as another way to check for children and families that might be unlawfully resident or sort of ripe for border enforcement. The good news is that a group of amazing activists based in London, actually, I think, called is it Action Against Borders for Children? Is that right? ABC, yeah, Against Borders for Children. They launched this campaign because it is outrageous. They launched this campaign, and fortunately, people like humans in London and elsewhere realized that this was outrageous. Actually, not to mention really pushing the boundaries of data protection legislation. And again, this is where I say, states can do things that are unlawful, but if they're not challenged, then they remain lawfully unlawful. So ABC were successful in challenging this agreement, which eventually DFE agreed would not come to pass. But it is important to remember, again, just as I mentioned the UNCRC, it's important to remember that these sort of suspicions we have, so communities that have suspicions about things like giving correct or personal information to schools in enrolling their children, they are grounded in something as well, right? There are real historic reasons why people might have these fears, and so I say that, and also I suppose as a plea to be gentle and understanding about reluctance, for example, to engage with authority. And then again, there's one more piece of, well, what do we do now? You will all know, of course, that there's a duty on parents to ensure that their children attend school, and there are fines for non-attendance. But also, in the guidance and in the way the legislation works now, schools don't require to check migration status because the duty actually sits on families to establish that their children have the right to study, okay? Which is how actually NRPF works. So anyway, no recourse to public funds doesn't punish public authorities for giving public funds to people who don't have eligibility for it. It punishes the individual. So if I access the public fund, it actually invalidates my right to remain. So it's the same. So parents have an obligation to ensure that their children have the right to study, but parents are also penalized if their children are in school. And I don't know if I did it very well in these bullet points, but what I'm trying to sort of depict for you again is like quite a lumpy, difficult to navigate landscape for your average migrant parent. So I can, and this is one of those ways in which maybe lawyers are a bit unhelpful. I can explain to you how complex this is, but then you have to decide what you're going to do. And we try to acknowledge that in the briefing as well, with these little boxes that sort of say, here's the information, but you need to decide, you need to decide what you're going to do about it. Okay, so just a few screenshots from the report itself. Oh yeah, okay, so some things that could be helpful. I'm just looking at this today, I realized that this was written in June 2024, so I refer throughout to biometric residence permit, which very soon will become an e-visa. That's why the report is digital. It's digital though. we can update it. Anyway, so some things that might be helpful, particularly if you are working with people who are not like migration experts. There is a wee table in there trying to map common immigration statuses against the kind of sort of what it means, the kind of entitlement it is, and then roughly what the right to access is or isn't, and what kinds of evidence you might see in order to establish that someone has this status. You're not meant to be many immigration advisors, but actually I know that withholding this information is not very helpful either, right? Because how is a caseworker, not a specialist caseworker, but someone just in the course of their job, maybe an education advisor, how are they supposed to know what to do? So there's a wee 2-page table in there. Go to the next one. Okay, there's a bit about, yes, let's change that. There's a bit about policy advocacy and campaigning strategy. Remember I said it's not just the law and what to do. And so I've just given an example here. So we talk, I suppose if you think about, again, if you think about the world from the perspective of a lawyer, we mostly talk about litigating. But in order to work out whether something can be litigated, you need to work out whether it's the law that's the problem or it's actually practice that's the problem. And sometimes if you have that conversation with individuals and communities, you find that they're able to better sift sort of practice issues that they can tackle sort of as it sits, and issues that need to be taken to a specialist solicitor basically for kind of further consultation. So this is an example of maybe a gap between policy and practice. So although UK education policy claims to support the inclusion of migrant children, many schools lack the necessary resources and trained staff to support children with English as an additional language. Seems like everywhere. seems like that's basically true. And so an example of the kind of suggestion in the report, I'm going to say humbly suggestion, includes an acknowledgement that of course there is a kind of complaints and maybe legal route. So the first things are very practically in this particular case, start the complaint, or also look at whether this is strategically, whether this is a school-specific issue or a local education authority-specific issue or a national problem, because strategically and from a campaigning perspective, it might tell you who else to work with, whether this has become a bigger thing that you want to tackle with other people and so on. But also, in a peer-led way, encourage others to complain in order to increase the pressure and raise awareness of the issue, and then think about whether a more direct and effective approach is a political route as well. So it may be the case that in speaking with councillors and local politicians, some of whom I know are here today, or MPs, this isn't, it isn't necessarily the case that complaining individually or suing the school is the most effective outcome, right? So, and I think I said this when we were speaking earlier, I've observed, and I think you all have, that rights are easier to uphold where there's adequate resource and where there is adequate capacity and funding. And so over the years in different areas, I wouldn't say, maybe just more realistic, I've become more realistic about many different ways to achieve change, right? And so the other thing that we spoke about a lot, and I'm excited to see, is that none of these things are sequential. They can all be done at the same time, but they do need to be coordinated, right? Like the greatest strength in making change through law and campaigning is talking about it, doing it together. It's more efficient. And communities and charities are really good at that. Actually, they're good at doing a lot with very little. Okay, so this is now just too small. Sorry about this. Okay, I'm not going to read the whole thing to you. I'm just going to explain that this is another part of the report. This is kind of more the typical case study law legal analysis. So the case study here was immigration status inquiries. So as I said earlier, IRMO has an example of a family being asked to show their boarding passes, and other schools are asking for immigration status on their application forms. So that's kind of the question up here, or the issue. And then in the analysis and guidance section, there's, where I can, and there are footnotes in the report, there are direct quotes from pieces of guidance or other things that would be useful. So if this is you, or you are the caseworker, you can actually just copy paste this. The other thing that I should mention, I hope it's okay to mention, is that I have done some template letters for IRMO, which are not at the back of the report. So, and they link to what you see in the report. So the idea is actually for some key issues to make it as easy as possible for parents and caseworkers to just pick this up. But I've given a bit of a quote because we all know that it can be more effective when you're making your approach, which can be in very plain language, to also support that with the piece of guidance or legislation that gives you kind of credibility for what you're saying, which is no, you can't have the boarding pass, and how dare you? Okay, and then this bit is just it's to help people start to analyze this. I guess the way a lawyer would. So the analysis is that the guidance makes it quite clear that this isn't something you should do. So this is therefore a gap between policy and practice. But in other places, which makes it easier to know how to discuss this with the school or how to approach it. But in other places in the report, there is an acknowledgement that actually this practice is possibly lawful, and then therefore, what do you do, right? You need to campaign, you need to, take evidence. And then the last piece, and this is where we had a conversation about the reality of supporting families in a hostile environment. and making sure that they have the information that they need. So the last thing, the little warning triangle says, you do have the right to refuse to provide this, right? But you do need to, like, your concerns about thinking through what that might mean are also potentially valid. So just, you know, so you need to think it through and make that decision. Now, it pains me to do that, but we all know, again, we all know that the only correct way to advise people is to be honest about all of the risks, okay? And certainly in my own casework, and possibly in yours, across a number of areas of access to services over time, I have seen this happen. So I've advised families who have done this or that and then been detained. So we do need to always be very clear about the risks that people run. Okay. All right. I promise we'll sort of end up. We're just about to end. And then the last part of the report. So Karen, I heard Karen say that I would share like the findings, and I realized that I didn't put in a slide at the end that actually gave you the headline recommendations, but that's okay. They're there at the end of the report. You'll find them. But the last part of the report, what I tried to do is to kind of present the same themes or the same topics in a different way, so thinking about long-term change. So we did specific case studies and what people can do now if this is happening to them. And the last part of the report, I sort of bunched together common challenges. So for example, a delay in school enrollment or a refusal to progress, gap referrals, including, and there is a whole piece and a template letter about challenges in enrolling young people at years 10 and 11. And we have a set of recommendations for the IRMO Thrive project team, but also recommendations for the DFE and for local education authorities. Just, just pointing out, in many cases, just pointing out about things like clarifications in guidance, which would be a relatively quick fix, but would give people some comfort or some transparency, which I'm really keen on actually, and other things. So the DFE and local education authorities have a great deal more discretion than they sometimes exercise as well. So again, I think it's a conversation or a campaigning. There's a sort of campaigning point there about how this can work better for a particular group of young people. Okay, I think that takes us pretty much to the end. Okay, so yay! So the report is full of lovely pictures, like that. And I guess I want to say something that I used to say about the UNCRC to social workers, and it's this: that actually migrant children are children first. Yeah. And actually, if you take that as the starting point, you will always be asking after that, when the migrant child you're working with has been excluded from something, you'll be asking why. It is the most simplest form of advocacy. Just ask. They're children first. Why is this different? So why is there a different treatment? Why is there exclusion? And then just one more slide. And that's how you can get in touch with me. And let's go past that really fast.
No.
And this is the final slide. Right. Okay, so just to say thank you very much for coming today. And for listening, and I do realize it's like after work on a Thursday, and that means that you people are amazing because you're all here because you make the world a better place, and a more equal place for children, and by extension for all of us. So thank you very much.
I've been working with Jen for the better part of 9 months, and she still just shocks me every time I hear her speak. Thank you so much, Jen. That was incredible. Could we take some questions now from the audience if anyone has anything they'd like to ask Jen at this stage? Yes, please.
Thanks for that. I just wanted to ask, my name's Anita Bain from the Information Advice and Support Service in London. I wanted to ask about 16 to 18, you just spoke briefly about where rights tend to sort of fall off for that age group. I was wondering if you could just expand on that a little bit.
Sure. Shall I take a couple and then take 2 or 3 in?
Yes, one over there in the back.
Hi, I'm Madeline Keller from Southwark Law Centre. I was wondering, particularly around asylum-seeking children and children in hotels, I noticed that when you cite the government departments, you look at like local authorities and the Department for Education, but I'm sure, I know we've spoken offline, but the difficulty in getting data from the Home Office as part of your research. how much, who, the kind of for science children in particular, who is responsible at the end of the day. The primary responsibility lies with the Home Office to make sure that they communicate with local authorities to make sure that children know where they are. And I just wondered what came out of your research through this and what more can be done to kind of hold them to account.
Okay. One more? Two more.
Hi, I'm Shabin from Project 17. I guess I've got a question about whether we know much about the scale of data sharing between schools and the Home Office. I guess we know that they have the power to report, and I just wonder if we know much about how often that's used.
Yeah. And Project 17 does a lot of work on data sharing, actually, yeah, totally.
But not really the schools.
Yes, I think you have it there.
Yeah. I wonder about the impact of Brexit in the ECHR framework impinges on your project.
The impact of Brexit.
Yeah, you will.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Can I, maybe before I forget what everyone has said? Okay. Yeah, okay. So, yours 10 and 11 are about 16 plus. That was the first question, right? So, how do you, from IAS, is that right?
That's
I used to work at IAS many years ago. Okay. So, this is a really good example of, there are two overlapping challenges here, I suppose. So this is a really good example of where children do have an entitlement, so they have an entitlement to entry, but you have practical barriers first of all. So very often, what children were seeing in their case studies here in the Thrive cohort was that they were just being told that there wasn't space. There wasn't space. That complaints to the local authority would yield sort of delays. And there is a kind of, there's almost, it seems, there's almost an obligation on local authorities to provide further opportunities, as you know, so post-16 opportunities, but because of constraints on migration status or lack of resource, no such opportunities exist. So it's a really kind of rights meets practice space. And I suppose, and here actually I would really love, because I can sort of see Clare nodding, I would love in the next part, in the panel where we're actually going to hear about the advocates who work locally and who support and who actually, the solicitors who actually will take these cases, I would love to hear what you think about whether this is challengeable, whether challenging it is the right way forward, and so on, because actually it feels at the moment like there's an entitlement that isn't being taken up, or if it is being taken up, it's only through kind of the persistence and the guile and the discretionary exercise of authority in some places of individual caseworkers and families. So that's the first part. The second part is that aside from decisions by local authorities and DFE, there are a range of other opportunities that would be available to a young person who is who has settled status or who doesn't have unsettled or limited status, and they are, I suppose, when you think about educational provision, they're considered to be meeting that gap or that requirement. So I'm thinking, for example, things like apprenticeships or sort of those opportunities where you can primarily work and then do sort of pieces of courses, college courses, for example, and it is actually the funding or the lack of confidence, I suppose, in those providers that is the barrier. So it feels like, and I'd be interested to hear as well whether there is anyone in the room that is specifically working on that gap and sort of widening opportunities here. But it feels like that's the issue. So it's a combination, again, it's sort of a combination of authorities and then restrictions on things like lawful residence as an entry point to an opportunity that theoretically exists that would fulfill the local authority obligation, but isn't actually accessible by that young person. Okay, the second question was about the obligation of the Home Office. Okay. And you were thinking about asylum-seeking children, unaccompanied and accompanied?
Yeah, both. Yeah, I think the I kind of guess two parts of it is the lack of information that's shared by the Home Office to local authorities when children are placed in boroughs, and the barriers to engaging that, and then also subsequent to that, particularly in asylum hotels, where children don't, the impact of it that's having on their education for them to live up to 2-3 years at a time, even if they access education, the kind of untold barriers that they face because they don't have anywhere to study and all of that impact. So, and then like the responsibility, who is responsible for them, and how do we, correct it?
Yes. I kind of love that question, and I just sort of want to leave it there. And I also know that my colleague from REUK is probably going to speak about a piece of work that looks particularly at some of these barriers for asylum-seeking children. And in addition to what you've highlighted, so I don't know if there are gaps so much as like almost no communication between the Home Office and the particular needs of asylum seekers, not just children, in all of the local authorities where they place people. And I think that's been covered relatively thoroughly. But also there is a bit of a free-for-all or a lack of responsibility taken by the Home Office in terms of how it also disrupts children's education through a series of, in terms of how it runs asylum support accommodation. So often families used to go into temporary accommodation and then permanent accommodation, and even that wasn't great because that would often be done without regard to where children could enroll or where they were enrolled, and then you would have a gap, not just in access to education but in health. That worsened probably when we moved into contingency, so hotel accommodation, and I think you can also find, you could find before and you can still find now, because, and this is covered a little bit in the report, because of the sort of no-choice way in which people can be moved in the asylum system, and again, sort of the lack of information, there is an ability to make an application or resist a move actually on the basis of the impact for the children, but it's not exercised as much as it could be. It often needs a caseworker to do it. So the Home Office doesn't really take responsibility for that, although I in my own practice have been that person representing that, writing that letter, so it can be done, right? But it's something that has to be done probably with help. And I guess the most worrying thing, and then I think I'm wittering on, so I'll move on to the next. The most worrying thing about the Home Office is its persistent, I'm actually quite happy to say this even if there is someone from the Home Office here. It's actually its persistent lack of regard for its responsibility as a statutory authority around the rights of children. So even though it's there now in the Borders Citizenship Act 2009, the way that it makes decisions about things like this are a good example of how they don't have regard. And the most worrying thing in the last immigration bill, which hopefully will be unwound soon, was the proposal that the Home Office could be basically the corporate parent for unaccompanied asylum-seeking children. Now this is not okay because local authorities are the corporate parent for all our children. That is consistent with the principle that migrant children are children first. And actually, it's one of the reasons, it's actually one of the better things about our system until now, because local authorities are designed to, they are good at being corporate parents in this way. So the fact that the previous administration thought that it was stateable that the Home Office as an alternate statutory authority could be the corporate parent for just asylum-seeking children is worrying, actually, because it can only be a different standard, and you'd hope it wouldn't be a lesser one, but there doesn't seem to be any reason for that, right, other than a departure from whatever the standard of care is. So having not had an answer to you, I guess I just thank you for opening up that question. And then I guess on a practical footing, we certainly in my practice in Scotland, I point out what statutory authorities have obligations because you would potentially litigate against all of them. So just that makes sense. So it's important not to let statutory authorities off the hook. Okay, question 3 was, what do we know about data sharing from Project 17. I love Project 17. I'm totally obsessed with data sharing. There is a recommendation in the report that a really positive campaigning thing that we can all do is to advocate for like clear statements from education authorities that they will not data share for immigration enforcement purposes. Really simple, right? So I'd like to see that quite a lot, actually. I hope that you achieve it. In Scotland, and I'm reluctant to say this, in Scotland, the NHS has made that statement, and the previous SNP administration, we have to try again, had also stated that it would never enter an MOU between its education authority and the Home Office around this issue. So we secured that after this happened in England. So I think it's possible. That's an example of like something that's entirely in your power to do. So please do it. And then the answer is I don't, at the moment I don't know, but I think it would be great to FOIA that, I guess. Like, that would be a useful start to this campaign. I mean, you know, FOIA's, so Freedom of Information Act requests are limited, but they are useful. Okay, the last question was, what is the impact of Brexit? Well, I'll say this briefly. It is relevant to the Thrive cohort because a number of your families did have EU citizen status and took quite a lot of support from Thrive and other organisations in order to apply for pre-settled and then settled status. And so I'll say, so for your cohort, as for everyone else, of course, in taking people from a situation where they had relatively secure and clear entitlements to things, and putting them into, so a right as opposed to a privilege, and putting them into a system where they were subject to immigration control, and therefore their conditions of stay were a privilege. I think the impact mainly, yeah, it has been to increase the precariety of those children and families, and also in many cases, I'm sure, to raise questions about their entitlement to access things that they'd always accessed before. I think it's probably quite broad, but it's a real reflection of where we are. And I guess I'll just close by saying, so please everyone, given that e-visas are coming, right? And this is the same challenge as before. It's I'm not totally opposed, you know, in principle, but it is a process change that will always result in some people missing out. So please everyone, let's make sure that we do what we can so that happens to the smallest number of people. And I know that is exactly the kind of thing that organizations like IRMO and Clare are focused on. Thank you very much, everyone.
We will have a short coffee break, but I wanted to ask if there are any last questions for Jen. Otherwise,
I just had a quick comment, Jen, for you, if that's okay. So, just for a personal, hello, my name is Claudia. I'm a counselor in Hackney. For a personal experience, I've been trying to be deported. They tried to deport me a number of times when I arrived. They deported some of the family members. They tried to deport my child. So my relationship with the Home Office is interesting. I am now a counsellor in Hackney, and what we have, just as a comment for people to know, and it will come soon to IRMO, because what we've managed to do is to get the council to accept a motion that demands for the whole of the coastal environment policy to be reversed. It's going now for a vote in the next 2-3 months, and a number of us MPs and councillors are working across the country to bring this motion across all our councils. So I was really pleased that you put pressure on councillors and MPs. We think that if this is accepted, we're going to continue the campaign that all coastal environments are completely reversed and then withdraw. And I think all of us should just push for that. So I'll be sending that to push your council, absolutely, make them do the work. Everyone has the right to hear. Thank you. That's what I wanted to say.
Thank you very much.
brilliant. Thank you, everyone. Okay, we will take a short 10-minute break and then we'll move on to the panel. some people unfortunately leave a big gap over here, so brilliant. So I hope you all enjoyed Jen's insightful presentation and the Q&A and the networking during the coffee break. And now we're moving on to the next part of the event, which is a panel discussion where we'll explore the barriers that migrant and refugee children face in accessing education and how we can work together to overcome them. We're very fortunate today to have an incredible group of panelists, and I'd like to introduce them now. So we have with us Clare Cruz, who is the Education, Employment and Discrimination Supervisor at Southwark Law Centre. In her education work, she collaborates with grassroots organizations in Southwark and Lambeth to improve education outcomes for children and young people in both boroughs, particularly in minoritized communities. Clare's current focus is on addressing the challenges faced by children and young people in temporary accommodation in accessing and staying in education. Next, we have Niwaeli, who is part of the Welcome and Schools project at Refugee Education UK, where she provides support and guidance for young people seeking asylum and refugees to help them access education. Niwa is an educator at heart and has extensive experience in teaching and in the UK education system. After graduating with honours in education in Canada, she taught various group years in a primary school in Kent and worked in alternative provision to support young people back into mainstream education. She has also coordinated initial health assessments for newly arrived asylum seekers and volunteers, her time teaching ESOL boosters and organising a weekly community conversation cafe for people from forced migrant backgrounds. And finally, we have Claudia Lopez, also known as Miss Lopez, who is an educator at St. Gabriel's College with 16 years of experience in teaching, specializing in EAL. As a proud Colombian, Claudia's personal experience of overcoming language barriers in the UK fuels her passion to ensure no student is left behind. She supports Spanish-speaking students and their families through workshops, conferences, and community events, empowering them to break free from limitations and achieve their dreams. Her teaching philosophy centers on creating engaged, self-directed learners in an environment of relentless support and growth. Beyond the classroom, Claudia offers educational workshops in Spanish to help students and families navigate challenges, honoring her heritage and elevating the profile of education within the Latin American community in London. Brilliant. So thank you again to our panelists for joining us today and for the invaluable work that you do in this space. So now we can dive into the discussion. So each of our panelists, of course, brings a different perspective from their own sector, and I'm looking forward to hearing their perspectives on 4 same questions that we will all be discussing and answering. So to start, I'd like to ask you, in your opinion, what are the most significant barriers refugee and migrant children face in the UK education system? And if we can start with Ms. Lopez, please.
Thank you, and thank you to IRMO for inviting me to be part of the panel. It's such an honour, honestly, they do such amazing work. Goodness me, barriers, where do I start? How many? How long do I have? So, first of all, the language barrier. The language barrier, I mean, if you don't speak the language, you're stuck. You're stuck straight away. The lack of information that's, supplied for these families who are new to the UK. It's so easy to translate now. It shouldn't be still a barrier to these big organisations to not be able to provide these families with, material that these families can access in their home language. Miscommunication, lack of communication and lack of support from those who are meant to be supporting these families, from the Home Office to the local authorities. Sorry if there's anyone from the local authority here, but they need to do a lot more. These families are just left to a side, and I see these struggles every single day. It's something that just engrosses my education and my work. I was that migrant child, so I arrived to this country when I was 11 without speaking a word of English, with my migrant family, with my parents, not knowing anyone in this country who could support us through the education system, and seeing my parents feel helpless in that situation. Unfortunately, I'm still seeing these families feeling helpless. One thing that I always remember that my parents, and I'm sure lots of you will hear, we brought you to this country for a better education. That is the dream of migrant parents. It's not to take all the freebies, as everyone likes to portray migrants as. It's to for a better life for their children. But yet these organisations that are placed in a position of power to support these families are still not doing what they legally should be doing, which is supporting these families. Education is a child's right. There should, we're so big on, looking at, other countries where education is not free or girls don't have access to education. Well, why don't we start looking at ourselves right here? Because what we are doing exactly the same, but we're trying to paint a pretty picture and saying it doesn't exist. Well, it does, because you guys that are here, we that are sitting here at this panel, we know that that's still happening. So I think it's the language barrier, the lack of information, the lack of support that these families are given when they arrive to the country and when they're new to this country. Migration is not easy. It's possibly, as an adult now, I can't imagine migrating, that decision that my parents took. And what I like to say when we are talking about children and migration is that every child that migrates, that's a forced migration. It doesn't need to be because they're fleeing war or some violent circumstances. It's a forced migration because this migration is taken out of the hands of the child. It's in the hands of the parents. And, the parents are doing this because they want the very best for their child. But still, that migration for that child is a forced migration. I'll leave it there so that most of the people can speak.
Thank you so much, Claudia. That's really insightful. And of course, your perspective is directly from the classroom, talking to these children and who really like you and confide a lot in you.
Some days, not all days.
Thank you so much. Niwa, we'd love to hear about your experience from refugee education.
Yeah, so a lot of the work that we do at refugee education is enabling access into education for refugees, and especially in empowering their parents to be able to support children into school. And one of the biggest challenge that majority of the families that we work with, actually two of the biggest challenges, the one is the access, just the system itself is quite complex. So we've had parents who will call us and said they arrived in the UK, they walked up to their local school, and they were told that actually they need to go online and apply through the local authority. They cannot just show up at the school and apply, which is completely different compared to where they would have come from. And then so navigating that process of, okay, how do you even access e-admissions portal? What is that? Where do you begin? And then if you come in year admissions, it's a whole different process again, and every bar is completely different. So there's not a one system fits all for access. And we know the challenges when they get to year 10 and 11. If they arrive in the country past October, it becomes even more difficult. And it's even 16 to 18 once they arrive in the UK past October. So apart from just the challenges of navigating applications process, there is then the barrier of actually even getting to school. So we've had parents who've said to us that they can't afford travel to where their child has been placed to school. They can't afford uniform. The school expects parents to show up, especially in secondary school, with uniforms with blazers that are costing £40, £50 when you can't afford even just your daily transport for the week. So that's something else, and that's something that a lot of schools are not equipped to handle as well. And then in addition to that, then there's that access of issues of dispersal. So oftentimes, especially for those with going through the asylum process, they do not have a say in when they get moved. So we've worked with a family that we supported it took almost a year and a half to get the child into school, simply because we enrolled the child. Before they were even able to get into a school, they were moved. And where they were moved was too far for us to then get them back to even that first school. Got them to the second, had to redo the whole application. The third time, they got moved again. The third time, the council actually said to the parents, "We're so sorry, but actually your e-admissions, it says that you're still holding a place in another borough, so we are unable to enroll you." So we called the school, and the council was like, actually, the parent needs to call the other council and let the other council know that they've now moved and they need to unenroll and remove them. So imagine a parent who doesn't speak any English having to navigate all of that just to get their child into school. So you've got a year and a half of a child waiting because of either dispersal, complex education system, and just the access in itself, and that really shouldn't be happening.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I can't add much to those. Those are definitely issues we see. I think I would just zoom out maybe a bit further and say I think that the problem, one of the major barriers to families is the education system itself, and possibly even the system we've got of local authorities managing education, sitting alongside academy trusts, and no one really having responsibility, or a situation where a local authority has the responsibility to educate, but no schools that it runs, so it can't enforce that in any way. Complex admission systems that are impossible to understand, and siloisation within local authorities. So in relation to dispersal, the housing duty stays with the original local authority that you were in, but the duty to educate goes to the new local authority, and there's no follow-up, so the family moves, and who is checking what's happening to those children? And then they move again, and what's happening to those children? The fact that, I'll try and stop, but I will say the fact that the Home Office places families and pays no attention to what the resources in relation to school places are, where the families are placed, and to be fair to local authorities, that they can be told there are this many families who are going to be moving in to your borough, but they're not told how many children are in a family, so it makes it impossible for them to plan. If you think about how school planning works, that is done on the basis of the birth rate. So local authorities are suddenly supposed to find places for children that they've never accounted for, never mind the fact that these children may well have incredibly complex needs, will have language needs. You get disputes where, is that a special educational need? And schools are saying, no, actually it's a language need so that we don't have to fund it, things like that, because everyone has no money, and so they are just trying to pass the responsibility up on everyone else. And then you're saying to these families, oh, and here's the system and you've got to navigate it all. So we've got to look at the structure, at the financing of the system as well. It's a wider problem.
Could I just quickly, and this is about the navigation of the application process at schools. I also think that schools have a lot to do with this, and it's the school's responsibility as well. We need to be responsible for our families and for the families that we have in our local community, and the misinformation. Families can actually direct apply to a school. Families can legally go to the school and apply to the school directly. It's a bit more complicated when it's the transition process from primary school to secondary school, and when they're starting in year one in reception. But any mid-year admission can be done directly through the school. Now, if the school says, you have to do it through the local authority, that's simply the school not wanting to take on this family or doing the admission process themselves. But that's also where part of the problem is with all this information is, do I apply here? Do I apply there? Do I have to apply online? Do I have to go to the council for a paper copy? Can I go to this school? So I think that is part of the problem in itself. There's just this web of misinformation.
And also, I think, gatekeeping.
Yeah.
If we're being really honest about this, everyone is trying not to take responsibility, everyone is trying not to spend the money. So at every point you're hitting gatekeeping, whether that's the local authority, whether that's the school, and I think being really honest about that experience that people will have is really important.
Absolutely. Thank you. Yeah, I think everything that you've mentioned is also what we mentioned in the report. So the huge language barrier that parents face and families when applying for something that should be easy, and it should be one of the first things that families can do as soon as they arrive into the country. And I really like what you said, Claudia, about the motivations behind moving to another country. Ultimately, parents do it because they want a better life for their child. And as Jen mentioned, a migrant child is a child first and foremost, and it feels sometimes like children are being penalized for a system that is, as you mentioned, Claire, is difficult, it's complex.
It's broken.
Yeah, and Niwa, you were mentioning all of these barriers, and I thought I would mention that Niwa was one of the first people that I spoke when I started working at IRMO, and I was still wrapping my head around all the different barriers that that families were facing. And I remember you mentioned all of these already and the amazing work that Refugee Education UK is doing in trying to navigate this complex system, but I was also, I guess, shocked at that moment to realize actually there are a lot of gaps and a lot of barriers that you see day to day. One of them, and one of the topics that I mentioned the most, is year 10, year 11, how inconsistent it is, how you can call a school and ask, hey, do you have places for a student in year 10? And they'll say either, we don't really take students in that year, sorry, no new students. Does the student speak English? No? Oh, sorry, then no. And no way of really challenging or checking that. And even more complicated if it's an academy, right? So not knowing who to hold accountable, who to ask for clarification or further information. That is something that can be really tricky. And also what you mentioned about the shifting responsibilities of local authorities, so housing versus education. Further complicated if there are special educational needs and an EHCP that needs to move across boroughs, makes it much more complex. So thank you for those contributions. I think.
Can I add one thing actually as well? Sorry, I think this slightly came out over the summer. I think that racism is playing a big part in all of this. I think that's a massive barrier, and I think schools have policies, they know what they should be doing, but the actual living up to those policies and owning them is not happening in a lot of time. And I think it's very difficult for people, because if they try and vocalise that, if they try and explain what's happening to them, they're met with a sort of instant shutting down by people who don't want to sort of address that, who don't want to. And I feel it got worse over the summer with the riots and things like that. And I think that's something that does need to be addressed head on by schools and local authorities, and sort of taking that as a reality.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, also something from practice that has happened to me as I've been supporting families has been just challenging local authorities sometimes when I'm on the phone and saying, you're not allowed to do this. For example, with the local authority that asks for boarding passes, and the person on the phone not knowing if they were allowed to do this or not. So I said, I'm pretty sure you're not allowed to do this. And they were like, no, I think we are. And we were just back and forth debating whether or not they were allowed. And so a complete lack of even understanding within the local authority about what is okay, what isn't okay. Same with fair access protocols. That is something that I'm very concerned about, that there are certain local authorities that have blanket policies to not enable this mechanism for year 10 and year 11. And so you're effectively removing the only accountability mechanism that we have for children to be out of education for months at a time. And so that leaves us with tools, maybe campaigning, which are more long-term, but in the immediate moment when we need to get a child in school, it's incredibly hard. So I guess moving to a more positive point of view, can you share any successful initiatives or practices that can help overcome these barriers? I'd like to start with you, Claire, because I know at Southwark Law Centre this is a big part of what you do.
Yes, so we've started it's probably been going a few years now. We've got an Access to Education Rights project, which is the aim of which is to talk to and help grassroots community organisations. So it meets quarterly, and we have a discussion and we hear what is going on, what are the immediate issues that are impacting on people in Southwark. And then from there we frame how we're going to take policy decisions forward, how we're going to try and challenge the local authority, and then we provide sort of overarching advice to those organisations when they're dealing with issues within the community, so that we can help them with the more specialised element. But the idea is we're training people up to have that knowledge themselves and to advocate within their communities, hoping that it will mean that our sort of specialist legal knowledge doesn't have to be sort of brought in, because if people can resolve these things at a much earlier stage, that's much better. Things drag out. If you end up in the SEND tribunal, if you end up in a judicial review process, it is going to take you years. And all that time, that child, that young person is sitting there without access to sufficient education. So the hope is twofold, that we empower local people, local groups, but also that by doing that we can get earlier resolutions and earlier successes for children and young people, so that they are not as impacted by being out of education or being in the wrong kind of education for a longer period of time.
Absolutely. Thank you, Claire. What about you, Mia?
So at REUK, we just launched our Educational Professions Network. And the whole purpose of that is that we recognize while we were working in schools that oftentimes around a young person, you'd have a social worker, you'd have a school admin, you would have other charities, organizations that are working around the same young person, but none of them actually talk to each other, communicate. So the whole purpose of the Educational Professions Network is providing a space where all professions who work to support young people can come together. We provide training, so that's training about supporting young people to access education, so whether that's in FE or HE or even just secondary school, but also providing a space where practitioners can come and discuss some of the challenges and some of the things that they're working with, and sharing solutions as well. So one of the, we just launched our late arrival research, and from that we actually recognize that there is some really good practices happening across the UK, but oftentimes they're not highlighted and practitioners don't know about them. So for example, in London, there is a school called Sir George Monaux. They enroll children all year, and they will never say no. They have yet to say no to any of the children. So if we can enroll a young person, especially in year 10 or 11, we would enroll them there. And they will work to provide bursary support to get their child into the school, even if they're not from their borough. But they've created a program called an accelerated learning program, in which they integrate GCSEs and ESOL and ESOL and A-level. So a young person, no matter how late they come to the country, can still have support while they're learning ESOL to still do their GCSEs and then continue on to do their A-levels. And they're actually really good. They'll keep some of the young people till they're 19 just so they can get them through to A-levels. And for me, that's a program that actually needs to be highlighted. And, you know, we talked to another organization called MTAS in Hampshire, and seeing how they're supporting parents and empowering parents to be able to advocate with other parents and work together, and actually getting parents into the school so they can support with language learning. So there's lots of really, really good resources, and that's what we're hoping the Professionals Network will be able to do, is a place where all these different organizations can highlight the good work that they're doing, but also share what can be done in their own, in local authorities and schools.
So for me, it's, you know, the outstanding EAL provision that we have at St. Gabriel's College, and I say outstanding because it really is outstanding, but that can't be done alone. Who knows what EAL stands for? Yes. EAL. What does EAL stand for? And what does that mean? So who's an EAL child at school? Absolutely. Because sometimes people think EAL, oh, it's just the children that are new to the country that don't speak any English. EAL is any child who hears another language at home besides English. Now, if you think in London schools, let's just think of Lambeth and Southwark. You know, where I work, it depends on the day, we're about 57, 58% EAL, or about 27% Latin American in the school. Now, the EAL provision that we have at the school is something that we'd like to, you know, role model to other schools in the local borough. We actually have an EAL curriculum for our new arrival students. All EAL students are monitored throughout the whole time at the school, and if they need that support, they may need that support. We know that when we have an EAL child, their vocabulary, they're missing 2,000 words in their monolingual English-speaking peers. So they may be fine in primary school, but then they hit year 10 and they've got that grammar that they just don't have. Why? Purely because they're EAL. And we know bilingualism is such a positive thing to have. That should be celebrated in schools. We also accept students throughout the whole year. We only say no if really we are over the limit in a year group. We don't accept students in year 11 purely just because of GCSEs. If we do have a year 11 student that needs to join the school, we put them back a year. So we place them into year 10 so that they have 2 solid years or a year and a half of that education. And I've not had one family turn me down for that offer, because I sell it to them as, this is a benefit for your child. They're going to go into year 10, they're going to have this 1 solid year of education. They'll be able to at least try and sit their GCSEs. EAL and new arrival students are amazing. I cannot tell you how amazing children are. Their brains are like sponges. They all come with their, with their different traumas, with their different experiences. I've got, year upon year, I've got students that start in year 10 and they pass their GCSEs. They get better GCSEs than the children born in this country. We see that year upon year that EAL students are achieving higher grades, because that's what we need at school, the grades, than their monolingual English-speaking peers. We have a curriculum where students are able to take their GCSEs, they are able to take another exam that's called the AQA Step Up to English. We have a new arrivals program where I'm the first person that welcomes the family to the school, so that they have that hopefully friendly face when they first joined the school, because I know I was in that position, my mum was in that position. I don't want anyone to feel how we felt as a family, how I felt as a student, staring out of a window, being called a daydreamer, because I didn't understand the language. What else was I meant to do? Daydream. And I'm hoping that we can roll that across more schools in Lambeth, where there is an actual EAL set curriculum, where students are admitted into school, where you can put them back a year. You can put them back a year. I know, and for many families, if you might say that to an English family, they might think that's a bit weird, but where I'm from, Colombia, you get put back a year if you don't pass the grade, and in many South American countries and Spain. So it's absolutely, normal practice for a lot of these families. And 9 out of 10 times these children, they want to learn, they want to be in education, and they'll sometimes see some of the things that are going on in the classroom. They'll be like, wow, I can't believe, you know, children aren't grateful for the education that we're receiving. So I am at the moment, I'm going to oversee EAL across the borough of Lambeth, so I'm hoping to implement some of the strategies that I've been able to put in place at St Gabriel's at a lot more secondary schools throughout the borough.
Lambeth is lucky to have you, definitely. No, thank you for that. I think that is a really, really great overview of, the different strategies that we can adopt as organizations, as case workers, as individuals to help combat this problem. And I guess the first theme is to share our expertise and our knowledge. If we have best practices that we can share, to do those and share them with other organizations, with individuals. And from our experience at IRMO, there's also a big component of empowering the families themselves and the parents. So for instance, I will always try to explain to parents, sit down with them, really go through an admissions policy or an EHCP complaints policy, a safeguarding policy, and say, let's review this together. What do you think about this? This is something you can cite or you can quote in the next meeting. And parents want to feel like they're a part of that deliberation. They don't want to feel like they're being talked at. They want to participate, obviously, in the issues that concern their children. And another theme is finding allies, both in individuals and in organizations. And that's, for example, schools for us. St. Gabriel's College is a huge ally that we have relied on very much at IRMO, but also really great to hear about St. George Monod. And I know that the international schools in Lambeth are also becoming allies as well. And I wanted to mention also finding allies within local authorities. I know many of you here are from local authorities, and just wanted to say, we really appreciate the work that you do, being allies to us and helping to, trying to move the needle forward and improving the situation for migrant children. And finally, you mentioned just better EAL provision and hand in hand with celebrating EAL, which I think is so important. And I love seeing photos of just Latin American young people feeling proud of their heritage. That is so, so important, and not feeling ashamed of speaking two languages, which is really, really cool. Those are some really, really great answers. Thank you very much. I guess this ties into the previous question, but it's more specifically on what opportunities do you see for collaboration between schools, local authorities, and voluntary sector organizations to better support these children? Would you like to?
I think it's just having that well of knowledge that if I don't know this, can I ask you and you'll give me the correct information, because a lot of the time it's misinformation as well. And when we're helping these families and we want the best for these children education wise, we need to have access to the correct information. For example, I run a number of workshops with IRMO specifically on the transition process. Why? Because I know it in and out. I could, anything that to do with transition process, I can tell you. Whereas it might be something to do with immigration status, I'll have to go to IRMO and say, hey, So I think it's all about building that network and those relationships, because one person can't change the world. We need to be able to work together and work positively together, because at the end of the day, we just want the best for these young people and their families. So I think it's all about collaboration and building the network, which is why I think events like this one this afternoon is so important, because I'm sure there's lots of you out there that you can support me in some way. It's fantastic hearing that another school is kind of doing what we do at St. Gabriel's, because it just goes to show that there are schools out there that are doing it. So why aren't all schools out there doing it? Because it can be done.
Yeah, and definitely second that. But I think one of the other things is just communication. So one of the things that we're doing in Oxford is Oxford Council came to us and said, we have a large number of unaccompanied minors who are having to wait an extended period of time. Is there anything you can provide to support them while they're waiting? So what we then developed an orientation program. So their young people used to be 10 weeks, but we went back to council and said, actually, that's unacceptable. We'll run an orientation program for 4 weeks, but within that 4 weeks, we expect that you should have made a provision to ensure that those children are in school. So that's an opportunity for the council, the local authority, the social workers, as well as the charity organization to actually partner up and create a solution. So I think charities are stepping up and they're filling in the gaps, but oftentimes we're not communicating what gaps we're filling, or we're not even communicating what gaps are in our area and how we can all collaborate to fill the gaps. So I definitely do agree that collaboration is key. in moving forward with anything.
I think I'd just add that it's really important that everything has a national focus. I think sometimes because responsibility for education ends up with local authorities, things can get very siloed within local authorities. And if you're thinking about families that might be moved very much and moved from one authority to the other, you've got used to one system of support in one local authority, and this person might do this, and this voluntary sector organisation might do this. Then you move somewhere else, and it's completely different. There may not be that support. And I think it's so important that we need to try and have a sort of more national, more sort of, I know it's a lot to ask, and I know the resources aren't there, but you know, in my ideal world, that's what I would want, where you could know that if you were moving from one local authority to another and you had to sort of restart education there, rather than trying to go back to where you were because things are set up, that when you move, things are set up because there's a sort of minimum standard, and everyone is trying to share best practice and work together. And I appreciate that probably sounds a bit pink and fluffy, but I keep going to events and being quite negative, and that's, I think, a dream, and I don't think it's an unachievable dream with a bit of forethought, with a bit of people trying to work together, local authorities trying to talk to each other, sharing best practice as well. I think it could be manageable. It doesn't feel like something that's completely unachievable, but I think it requires a lot of mindset changes to get there from a lot of people.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That is a really, really great point. I guess the big theme here is the importance of collaboration and communicating, and I guess having both us reaching out to local authorities, to different stakeholders and actors before there's even an issue. This also echoes what you mentioned of earlier intervention, having good practices, good relationships before there are any situations where we have to support a specific family. But equally also these organizations, these local authorities coming to us for our expertise or perspective before, again, there's a family that is in trouble or needs translation or needs some sort of very specific service or support. And yeah, I guess understanding what gaps we are filling as the sector and trying to complement each other, that's a really, really good point. We are filling a lot of gaps, and that's fine, but I think it's important to point to local authorities, to the government, what we're doing, the scale of it, and understand that it shouldn't be, I guess this is a temporary solution, it shouldn't be considered as a long-term alternative. Yeah, and just having a national focus is a really good point. That is something that we see a lot. Families that when they're in London, they have a really fantastic support network, but then when they're moved elsewhere, and this is increasingly the case with the National Transfer Scheme, to have families just move to areas where there's not as many migrant support groups or who are very stretched. And so, yeah, I guess if there was like a standard, national standard that we could all kind of abide by, that would be a bit easier, definitely. And then, so what would you say would be the policy changes that are the most critical to ensuring that all children have access to quality education in the UK? This is I appreciate it's a very big question, but in your ideal world, what would change? What would be a bit different? Niwa, would you like to start?
I think for me, definitely much better joint efforts in communication between the Department of Education, the Home Office, but also the housing location, because oftentimes, like we know, the Home Office can move a family in an area and families will reach out to us and say they've just been moved. The housing authority will be like, actually, we have no idea that hotel is even there. And then the education department also has no idea that whole new hotel has just been set up. So I think better communication between the three would really, really be helpful. And also, I think for me, what would be really helpful would be the ESFA funding guidelines. So we talked about post-16 education. 16 to 18 education is still mandatory in the UK. However, the ESFA, which is the Educational and Skills and Funding Agency, is, in better word, it's worded in such a way that every college is open to interpret to how it best suits them. So there's oftentimes we will get young people who it says that you have to have an ID. However, the ID doesn't specify, it's just government issue ID. So you would get, one college will say, well, actually, we'll accept your Bill 201, we'll accept your ARC, and then the college will be like, actually, we will not accept you unless you have your Bill 201 and an ARC card. So in that sense, because in their mind, that's what classifies as a full ID or appropriate ID. And then things like what constitutes as, apprenticeships, having access to apprenticeship, you need to be able to say that you have a right to work. Well, asylum seekers don't have a right to work. And so oftentimes a lot of the funding for a lot of courses is based on that. is you have to have a right to work in order to access this level 2 or even access level 3 courses which are free for jobs. Well, if you don't have a right to work, the college can very easily say you can't actually access this course because you don't have a right to work. So things like that, things that can, or even the term refugee, like that is very, very loosely. So some colleges are happy to include asylum seekers in that term. Other colleges will say, no, actually that doesn't fit. So if there is a way where there is a wording that actually includes everybody rather than excludes, that would be my ideal.
That's great. I would love to also see that. And what about you, Claire?
I was wondering if I could go really sort of, I'd like to see just a mindset change in how people approach migrants. That's my sort of, I don't know. I think I'm in pink and fluffy mode today. I'm a history teacher that love that. That's my kind of dream. You know, I think we could really do with a reset in this country, a bit of I don't know how to put it any more bluntly than everyone could just cop on and realise that we need to see what we have, you know, in common rather than trying to divide people up and put labels on them. But if I lead inside the pink and fluffy sort of dream, you know, world, I would say what I think we need to do is to start seeing the right to education as being a wider issue as well, that it has health implications, that it has, you know, long-term social implications. In some of the work I do, we talk a lot about I do a lot of work around exclusions, the sort of exclusion to prison to potentially deportation pipeline. I would like if that kind of idea and concern was being thought about by sort of the NHS, perhaps saying, you know, if we got better education, if we got better education outcomes for people, this is sort of, I suppose what I'm saying is we should see all this as an investment. Education is, I think, just seen as an expense, and I would like a mindset change where we go, these are young people, these are children, we invest in them and we'll create a better, you know, let's change the sort of, the language of budget cuts and things like that and go, actually, as a society, we need to invest. And actually, I would say a lot of children and young people made a lot of sacrifices for us over COVID and things like that. And I would like if that could be recognised and they could be rewarded for that. And we could start off by doing that by, you know, investing in their education. And I would say that you buy into that in a wider way because you can't learn if your housing isn't decent. And then that's when the NHS comes in, because if we improve housing, we improve health outcomes as well. But I think there's a sort of just a general mindset change that needs to happen. So yes, I'd like a reset on the way people approach, you know, the whole topic, but I would be delighted if there was a sort of education reset and we said this is not about the cost of things, it's looking and changing the way we think about it, and this is an investment. We are investing for our society's future, and if we could see it like that and approach it like that, that would lead to so much more. And then I would look at the whole structure of, I could go on for a long time, of education, of schools, of secondary schools. I think there are big questions to be asked about whether the education system we've got in this country is working at all and whether it's producing what we need it to. And that would be part of that. I'll stop because I'll just carry on and on and go into too much detail.
Thank you, that's really interesting. And I was going to mention also we will be taking also some comments and questions from the audience because I know that a lot of you here will probably have really interesting answers to that. But I would like to then ask you, Claudia, what you would envision as the...
So I've got two. One is post-16 education because it's a migrant's nightmare. And my main one would be that EAL provision should be a legal requirement in all schools. How is it possible that in this day and age there are schools that do not support their EAL students? There will be EAL students in every single school in the country. Why? Because I've just said EAL is any child that hears any language apart from besides English at home. And for me it's shocking that there are still schools with a high number of EAL students, with a high number of new arrival students, and they're not being, you know, supported in the way that they should be. You know, parents send their children to school to learn, to be educated. You know, those children should be made to feel welcome and they should feel safe at school. So how is it that in this day and age there are still schools that do not have any EAL provision for their young people, but yet they want them to get the grades so that the schools look good on statistics? These children are the future of this country if they choose to stay. They are going to be the future doctors, teachers. Unfortunately, none of my students want to be teachers. Doctors, teachers, they want to go into business. They were, into sports, into the, hairdressing, into beauty. They are going to be in every single sector of our community, but yet they are not being given the support that they legally should be receiving. So that's a whole, basically EAL in every single school.
Absolutely, thank you for that. That's really insightful, and I think you raised some really valid concerns about what's wrong with the system currently, and I guess to add a few more that again are from our experience at IRMO, just the prevalence of immigration as still a barrier to access education. Jen mentioned the prevalence of immigration related questions on school admissions forms. Why is that a question there? Why does it matter? The existence of NRPF in general, that's something I would mention. Other logistical barriers like proof of residence, for example, how that can pose such a practical barrier for families to sign their children up for school, and then the cost, the additional cost that parents have to incur to be able to show proof of residence, for instance, if they are subletting a room or an apartment and they don't have access to bills the way other families do, having to then pay for a sworn affidavit, have other costs that are hidden and that not all families have to incur. Another one is interpreters in schools. This is the bane of my existence. I mean, it's impossible that a parent who has a child that is, for example, going through bullying or behavioral situations or having any sort of important conversation, the parents are not even included fairly, and asking the child to be the interpreter is not right, especially not when it concerns issues about themselves. Also more focus on special educational needs for migrant children. What does that look like? What does it look to have to explain, to have an EHCP for a child when the family doesn't speak English? They can't even read the document. And I unfortunately, have seen few HCPs since I've been working here that are in English, and families don't understand what is on this document that is so important. So I echo very much what you were saying about ESFA funding guidelines. I mean, it is really difficult for 16 to 19-year-olds to access any kind of schooling, and also colleges, the quality of education really varies from college to college, and ESOL courses as well. It really varies. Contact time as well really varies. We need better communication between authorities. This is crucial. Different teams, sometimes, you as a caseworker, sometimes I'm communicating with 3 different people that weren't aware that someone was already in their purview. And clarifying terms. What does it mean in guidance when we talk about refugees, asylum seekers, even what's an apprenticeship? All of that is really crucial. And Claire, what you were mentioning about a mindset change is so important, and just how the wider issue of the anti-migrant sentiment in the country really does trickle down more than we realize. And seeing the rise in bullying, I'm sure Claudia, you can elaborate on this a little more as well, but mental health issues as well amongst our community, they're very, very common, and they feel this, like they are aware that this is happening, and it makes them feel scared, and it has implications for their day-to-day lives. Finally, EAL should be a legal requirement. I absolutely agree. It is fundamental, and if we are, using the Equality Act as one of the foundations of education here in the UK, it should be accessible to absolutely everyone, including if they don't speak English yet. That's just an overview of those answers. I would love to hear from the audience if there's anyone who would like to add anything or have any questions relating to this. It could be any of the 4 questions we've mentioned.
I was mentioning to Jen earlier, I think one thing that maybe hasn't been explicitly mentioned is prioritisation and the effect. I was born in London, and I went through the education system from the late 80s. I was in comprehensive school. The ethos of schooling, the lack of money making within schooling was completely different. I think also in terms of EAL, if you go back 20, 30 years, most schools had EAL departments. And so I think there's also a big question around and also the red tape around what is the expectations of teachers within schools, and a lack of trust. And I think there's also something to do with this sense of threat. In my casework at IRMO as well, I really felt that often you go in with something you see, like you hope the school is going to work with you with this problem, and actually the school is feeling very threatened that you're bringing up this problem.
That's what I was trying to get to when I mentioned racism. Like it feels it has the policy, that's enough, and really doesn't want to dig behind that. That's the way I see it. Yes.
In schools. You see that the school is not a safe place for children.
Yes.
Horrible things are happening. Parents go to schools and try to raise concerns about very serious bullying, very serious abuse. And then parents are completely silent, completely sidelined, and because it's a fear of the school that their reputation, the school has become a brand. And this is also linked to the fact that now schools are basically judged on exam results. So it's not about being an inclusive environment anymore. It's not about how children are thriving in schools in many different ways. Because ultimately you just want to have a picture-perfect school where everyone is uniformed, and that uniform is a brand that cannot be tainted. So you also hear, if a child has been involved in something that disrespects the kind of brand of the school in a fight or in something in like the outside of the school, that child will be excluded, not necessarily because they've done something in school that is really terrible, but because they have inflicted on the good branding of that school. I can go on, but and I think this kind of academization and I think there's also a thing which I guess you can look at kind of Scandinavia as a good example of this kind of professionalism of teachers and keeping people within the profession and creating this kind of culture of teaching that isn't just about getting the best results out of children, but as you were saying, in terms of it's creating healthy individuals who are engaged in community, engaged in society. How do we really go back to the roots of that, where we're nurturing the teachers to create these environments, which some schools you see do manage to do, but it's too infrequent that the practitioners within schools are really embedding these ethoses within these institutions. It's a complex thing. How do we get back to those kind of root values and creating schools that are for children and not for many other things that they have become more and more, I think, aligned with?
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. What you were mentioning as well about academization made me think about how holding schools accountable has also become harder because academies have an entirely different process of complaints, and even that is more complicated, to have to explain, that there's a different route, that it's the Department for Education that would be then, liable to give any information around academies and the practices that they do internally. I was wondering, Niwaeli, because you work quite closely as well, a lot with academies, if you have any insights on that. I guess, what their views are with regards to...
I think, so majority of the schools, so because we work with predominantly with the schools project, primary and secondary schools, we are finding that across the UK, a lot more schools are being, I guess, put into academies. So we're having to work with academy chains, and obviously academy chains do vary, different academy chains vary, but we do tend to find that the ones that we're working with, there is a change because they have approached us. So they do want the best for their children, and they have noticed that they have gaps, a lot of gaps. And they've said, this is an area where we're not doing as well as we should in supporting, whether it's our EAL or whether it's our forced migration children, because we know that our teachers don't have the necessary support that they need, and we do require training, we do require support. So for those academies, it's great, but we also recognize that not all academies are the same, so it's not having a one-size-fits-all. But I also do find that Ofsted makes it really, really hard. So one of the challenges that we get with the work that we do is parents don't understand how Ofsted works. So they will say to us, "Oh, I want my child to go to an outstanding school," and you're like, "Okay, but what does that mean?" And oftentimes we're having to tell parents that actually an outstanding school is a school that's good for your child, that meets the needs of your child. It might not be outstanding in the eyes of Ofsted, but it might be outstanding in meeting the needs of your child. And I think oftentimes we don't spend enough time highlighting just the social and mental health support that some schools provide. And they might not be outstanding in terms of academics, but actually they're really, really good in providing that wraparound support for families and children. And so oftentimes what we do say to academies is, you need to kind of shift your focus. You need to focus, okay, how are we actually reaching these families? Are we being the best, providing the best care for the family? And then worrying about the grades second. Because when a child is safe, they feel valued, they are looked after, and also their interests are put first, they will thrive.
Yeah.
And we know that. So it's making sure that that's...
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I would like to also, the link, being at school, it's a triangle. The school can't work by itself, the people can't work by itself, and the parents, the family, whoever's caring after the young person can't work by themselves. We're a triangle, and we need to actively work together. And I mean, I feel that when you have EAL provision, I do feel that the person leading EAL has a huge responsibility. And I know maths and English and science are so important. Get those grade 4s, okay. But, academia is so much more than maths, science and English. It's about the creative arts. It's about fostering a love of learning. It's about making children feel happy and safe and secure in their own decisions that they're making. It's about a stage A, which is what we call a new beginner child, being able to perform in front of the Mayor of London, who's been at the school for 2 weeks. It's about, a student being able to stand up in an assembly and read a prayer or a Church of England school in their home language, and having that confidence and that belief in themselves that they can do things like that, and it's okay. Being able to write in their English book in their home language and not feel that that's a barrier to their learning, or that's a negative aspect in the class and they're just going to get a red pen over it. So I do think that as educators we need to be held accountable for our actions and how we are supporting our children, I always call them my children, our students. And I just think you need to also have that passion in you as an educator. I think I wouldn't be able to do what I do if I wasn't passionate about it myself. So I think that's also about, educators having a love of learning and a love of teaching. I learn every day. I learn from my children. Sorry, there I go, my children again. I learn from them every day and I teach them every day. And I think, I don't want to be seen just as a teacher. I'm also a person, and just as much as I hope you're learning from me, you have got a lot as a young person to teach me. So I think it's a lot of that as well.
Absolutely, thank you. There are some hands raised over here. Yes, I'll take you first.
Yeah. I was wondering, is this a question more of a comment, and for Claire to potentially add to what I was saying around the big policy changes? I think that Claire knows well that I spend a lot of my time at the Law Centre ranting about access to justice and legal aid. And I think that one of the things that maybe is missing in this conversation is the barriers around legal aid, both within the asylum system and the immigration system, and then within the education system.
Oh, it's a joke in education.
Yeah, exactly.
There's 24 providers with a legal help contract across the whole of England and Wales.
What?
So this is so that to get families access to, sorry Maddie, I know you really well, so I can just take this over. If you want to get access to help with getting your special education needs child, either to, if an assessment is refused, if the plan is refused, if the provision is wrong, the school is wrong, any of those things, or you have a concern about disability discrimination, unless you can get hold of one of those 24 providers, and there will be, there's already legal aid deserts, but there will be real legal aid education deserts, you may well have the eligibility. You're not going to find anyone to take that on for you. And if you are a kind of family that is eligible for legal help, you're not going to be able to access the system yourself. The reality is, our most vulnerable families, who are made even more vulnerable by the fact they've got a child with special educational needs or disabilities, are just being left, and they are the ones who probably will be in completely inappropriate education or not in schools, and I just can't understand how that's not more of a scandal.
Yeah.
Frankly.
And I think that's what, I think that's really important, but we all know that even from from the side of an immigration point of view where it isn't scope, there are supposed to be rights. We know like it's 50% of people who are accessing the immigration system don't have access to a lawyer now. And I just, it's something that I think needs to be talked about whenever we talk about these issues, like, and also from different points of view, because obviously like, we rant about it all the time as lawyers and like they kind of expect us to, but other people, educators and other health partners and everything, we need to bring access to justice and advice as part of that conversation, and we need to work together to make sure, because they won't only listen to us, but they might listen to teachers and they might listen to other people, and I think that some people don't understand the barriers of, or not fully understand why people can't access to a lawyer because of the immigration or legal aid or the education legal aid system, and so we need to like really share that data, so every time you speak to the powers that be, like add that in as like an extra like tag along to that, oh, and reform legal aid provisions, you know.
I think every family with a child with SEND is incredibly dependent on the school they're in, on the SEND code that is there, and that is something that is not appreciated enough. And then I think that is made, I don't want to even numerate, I was going to say 100 times worse, but probably significantly more than that, 100 times more difficult if you are a migrant family, because not only are you reliant on the fact that the school will be able to pick this up and help you with it, there might be challenges within your own community that, you know, understanding what all this means. And it may well be there are language barriers that help you prevent, I mean, the EHCP not being in a language that you can understand. Well, if you want to enforce that EHCP, how are you going to know what's in it so you can enforce it? And how much is really down to parents having to be incredibly proactive and understanding that. And then how do you do that on top of being moved every month or 6 months, and being in really unsuitable accommodation? I mean, so how do you ensure that the therapies that your child might be, if you're in a hotel or if you're, you know, it's sort of, and these families are just going to, I worry, increasingly these families are just going to fall off the radar. And I don't understand why more people, it's not more of a discussion. And I know, to be fair, some news organisations are that, you know, there is increasingly more, but you have to kind of dig down and find it. And I feel that's, you know, SEND is sort of being recognised as an issue, temporary accommodation has been recognised as an issue, and I kind of want to say to people, but what about the families that have got both of those issues? Yes. Can you just sort of deal with how horrific that is and how many barriers they've got to try and access it? You know, I've got a child with complex needs. It's taken me 18 months to get her into the right provision. And that's because I understand my rights. I make a big fuss about them, and I think everybody in my local authority in the education department, they've probably got a voodoo doll of me up, you know, they stick things in. But I can do that. I understand what my child's entitled to, and I'm not afraid to enforce the rights. And it really worries me. There's a big group of people who've been through the immigration system who don't have trust in authority, you know, don't understand their rights, don't trust that those rights will be listened to and put into action, and then they've got to find out they exist to begin with. There's so many barriers, and those children are going to be left so far behind, and that's what I mean about investing in the children.
And I think it comes back to, like, an ad, like, that we want to trust all the schools all over the country, and how do we, and I hate this idea that also that, like, schools are so, like, exclusion rates are through the roof, SEN is, like, rising exponentially.
Oh, you should see the number of EHCPs that have been issued, and I'm sure if you had better early intervention, some of that wouldn't necessarily be needed.
And it's kind of also, like, symptomatic of these institutions that just don't know what to do with children. It feels like, yes, like, why can't we have schools that can have, like, great provision for a really diverse array of people within them? And how do we do that? How can that be seen? How can that be created?
Some of it,
it's not impossible.
It's not impossible, and there are some schools that are doing it, and they're doing it really well. And I want to say that because I think sometimes we can get hung up on that. But I think they're being hamstrung by lack of money and lack of just general resources, people, things like that, and lack of support. And I think that's what as a society, there might be a wider discussion we need to have. Because, you know, I was very taken by what Jen says. Everyone says children have rights. Everyone says children have the right to access to education. But when we as a society we're asked to pay the cost for that, we suddenly all start going, oh, maybe, you know, I come back to Kemi Badenoch saying that neurodiversity is just a golden ticket, which, but that mindset is starting to worry me, because what we're basically saying is, well, maybe if it's a golden ticket, people are getting more than they're entitled to, so do we need to pay for all of this? It's very, very worrying where that will go, and I'm terrified that attitude will seep down, and decision makers who are looking at plans and under huge financial pressure. I'm not going to pretend I think the way local authorities have been treated in terms of what they're expected to do and the budgets they have is in any way fair, because it's not, and they have been left to basically make these cuts so that the government can pretend that there are these rights, and then they just don't exist for a lot of people when you actually get to the reality of it. They're rights on paper. But yeah, that sort of thinking and that influence starts to go, well, actually this doesn't really exist, or this is people just trying to sort of get, this golden ticket and stuff, and it's
and then you get this phrase around it takes a village to raise a child, no?
Yeah.
And you're like, well...
But how can it take a village to raise a child? And I will stop talking because I can get carried away in a minute. If your village is in one place and you are being taken from that village because you're in temporary accommodation and moved somewhere else, and you're trying to get back there because your village is that school that you trust, or that community that you've built up. Anyway.
I wanted to add also on that point that it's funny that it would be referred to as a golden ticket when I witness what an enormous difficulty it is for families and for parents that have to navigate this system. It isn't.
There's no ticket.
No.
There's no ticket.
But I think it's incredibly disenfranchising, because if you hear that as a parent and you think this is as good as this, I'm getting the best of the system, this is my golden ticket, and this is it.
Yeah.
You're just not going to try and enforce anything. You're not going to fight anymore. You'll just give up.
And I'd just like to say with EAL students and SEN, it's a huge, deal. Okay, are they EAL?
Yeah.
Are they SEN? And it's so frustrating that the powers to be, not the school, oh no, you can't. This child you can't do a referral for this child because you have to wait at least 2 or 3 years to see if it's the language, because it might be the language, even though, language has got nothing to do with SEN needs. Maybe the EAL child has an SEN need, absolutely, because it's the child who'd be, maybe back in Colombia and they have SEN needs. But that, with a lot of, not shouting because I don't shout, with a lot of debating, shall we say, you can overcome that, I think it's also, in the position that I am, it's where it's predominantly Latin American students who do arrive to the school. I know if this child is not age-related in Spanish, I can see that they're struggling with their maths in their home language. I had a student, he was a character. He arrived from Colombia and he was just running all over the place. He was bouncing off the walls. I think you might have ADHD. If he had possibly been in another school, he probably would have gone 3 years without even having a referral. That would mean he would have had his referral in year 12. Simply because of the position that I am in, and the school that I'm in, the demographics of the students, we can get a referral. We don't see them as, we have to wait 2 years or 3 years. And this goes with any EAL student. I've got one from Afghanistan we're doing a referral for, and we're not. You don't have to wait the 2 to 3 years. So I think,
but that is incredibly unlawful.
Yeah,
sorry,
absolutely, it's horrendous. It's horrendous. But I think it also,
money, though. It's only about saving
money. You also
money.
need someone in the school that will fight for these children as well, and I think that's one of the issues as well.
Sorry, yes, you've got one question, and I just wanted to add one last very quick thing on SEND is also the variation amongst local authorities in the requirements. So, for instance, one case where I'm currently helping a family where the assess, plan, do, review cycle evidence is completely different between one local authority and the other, and even that is shouldn't be.
The test for an assessment is really straightforward and really simple, and that is just gatekeeping. It's gatekeeping, and it's unlawful, and just wrong.
Yes, you had a question over at the back here. I think, Councillor, you were yes.
Thank you for a lovely discussion. I just want to put all of those problems that we encountered. It's either by Councillor Lopez, to put all the problems that you have described, the challenge for children education, just to put it in a bigger context of the challenge that all children are facing in the country. Basically, it's an issue of disadvantage, poverty, and class all combined. The challenge that SEN asylum seekers and registered finding is the same challenge that poor children of any colour born here are facing. So just to kind of to see it within the big context, housing issue is a national crisis. So all the children, in my case, were 99% of this housing related. People born here, so people are being sheltered from one temporary accommodation to the next temporary accommodation. So the whole school, the children having to shift from one school to the next school isn't limited to asylum seekers and refugees. They also struggle to navigate the whole system. So it's and teachers, I want to stick up for teachers. I think teachers are doing the best they can. It's an impossible situation over the last however many years. We see the numbers of how many thousands of them leave the profession in drones because they come into it with such passion and what they want to do is something else, but what they've been dictated to do is different, with like just constantly dwindling resources. And I remember like 15 years ago, I was a youth worker in Lambeth for about 18 years, and you had support workers in secondary schools, emotional support workers. Even when my daughter started school 10 years ago, they had like 2-3 TAs in the classroom so they could support. Now you're lucky to afford a TA only if you have a child in the school who has in the class who has EHCP. So then you can afford a TA in the class that is going to support the rest of the children. So you try to spread it so thin. Teachers have it come lunchtime, playtime instead of doing what they can. So I think the challenge is that young and asylum seekers or refugees are finding themselves is already a challenge in this country that they're having to come to, so kind of succeed in that way. And advocacy is very useful in that. I think for me, like building relationships is very good with different networks, for example, like area. So whichever school, say if you're a small like refugee organization, you work in Lambeth, like having contacts, like that one contact person, say at Lambeth College, if you have the person that you go for, and say you've clarified what their criteria for admissions are, so at least the young people are not just going to turn out there and be given any kind of information. You can say, like, when you go there, go to so-and-so, and then they will kind of help you navigate that, build relationship with the council officers, counsellors as well. Try to work with counsellors as well. If you've got any issues like casework, like if you're in Lambeth, any caseworker, it's not just education, anything to do with migrants, always can come to me and then I can help you navigate it. So it's because as small charities, I also work in charities, because the complexity of problems have just multiplied, and no single person in the past we used to be able to do, I do this job and then I'll pass you on to school. So there's no such thing, you do all of those things as well yourself because there's nowhere to pass on people. So the amount of people having to do is less is more, but the way how we manage to survive this long is because of working so closely. There's always like this, and there's always peer group, sharing knowledge with other charitable organizations. So that kind of applies elsewhere as well. So we're very good at working within each other, the charitable organizations. We know each other. We've got this sense of solidarity, but it's always so good to build a relationship with someone.
And another challenge that we find as well is puberty.
When the councils have those scrutiny committees and other committees, just to come in as or call in to give evidence, they always want witnesses, those committees to be able to speak. So then, of course, you'll be in person, you get some counsellors, and you start building relationships. So it's just using whatever tool is at your disposal, because admissions is a difficult one because you've got academies. So local authorities, the most well-meaning admissions team can't do anything about it because academics, you haven't got any say in it. You cannot affect anything with them. So I guess, I don't know, even using community care services, legal aid services, I have no language to have. And the more you fight, it's just you feel like what's the point in keeping this child even after you fought to keep them there. They're not going to thrive in that school, they're not going to do it. So it's build a relationship with various counsellors, and even when they're moving to different local authorities trying to find us who, like the Catholic children or whoever it is, and then maybe you can just tie them along so they can help them. So it's having connected with other people also helps. Right?
Thank you, Councillor. That's a really excellent point, and I am just aware that we are close to 7. There are some last remarks. Please, Elia.
Well, 1 minute. I just want to praise the panel for the work they're doing in such horrible circumstances, the neoliberal system, the hostile environment, Brexit, absolutely hell. The experience we have in the 70s, 80s and early 90s, I had with my organization, Chile Democratic Educational Program, was the lesson after all those years was the empowerment of parents. If you empower parents, but at the same time, sort of the frictions between the second generation and the parents is already tackled. The results are very good. Why do I say that? Because the only way we were facing not the complexity you are facing now, but it was complex as well in the 70s and 80s. So my historical sort of lesson is that the empowerment of parents, the lessen the friction between parents and children, living in different language and context, and the parents trying to think about Colombia, Chile, blah, and the poor children are in the middle. So are the projects that emerge, like Saturday supplementary, complementary education, are extremely important. I don't know whether there are still these schools, because in Oxford I couldn't find any, I live outside Oxford, and in London I don't know whether to, but if you, with your expertise and wonderful experience, and IRMO with the traditional, pragmatic, incredible, is a resource, if you could empower those organizations, education, you can really change policies. You can really add something else to the curriculum. Because the curriculum is important as well. You just said that. And so, I don't know, my last word is praise. We were desperate then, we are desperate now, but you are doing things that need to be encouraged, and I recommend that liaison between you, the supplementary or complementary education that already exists, and the interaction to make it less frictional between the parents and the children. That combination of things is quite successful sometimes. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. So I'm just really curious and would love to hear your insights from the panel. So I work for Chance Gates, an organization for children between 5 to 12 years old. We've been working in a research about primary exclusions, and it was a national research, and the outcome was shocking. So 97% of the children who are excluded in primary school are SEN. So now I'm thinking, so it's already quite shocking. The European 80% are preschool meals. Some of them, they don't even have a plan, HCC plan. Now I'm thinking, these are family school. The majority of them are aware of how the education system works. They are aware of their rights. But how does it work with families who are not aware of how the education system works here in the UK, who might have a language barrier where parents might not know how to educate for the children? So I don't know if you have seen a link between migrant families and they being further excluded from education.
Yeah, so we currently work with a project to support disengaged young boys who are at the rate, at pretty much at the door of exclusion. So we work with schools majority in Croydon, and to be honest, I would say 99% of the young boys that we work with, they're all unaccompanied minors or majority of them unaccompanied minors or have come with families. And oftentimes it is because the ones that are with families don't even know that the boys are having issues in school. So because there's no communication, or because the communication is in English, we've had, we're lucky enough that we do have staff members who speak a variety of different languages, so we're able to actually have those discussions with the school, the parent, and the child. And oftentimes the school's like, well, we did let the parent know. We sent a letter home about this issue, or we did email them, or we did this, and the parent is like, no idea. And then the child also is unaware of why it is they're getting in trouble. So one of the child was being excluded simply because he would go home at lunchtime and he just wouldn't come back. So his attendance was one of the reasons. And I said to the school, well, have you explained to him that the school is a whole day? Because where he comes from, he goes home at lunch and that's it. And the parents didn't question it because that's what they've known. So having those discussions, I think having opportunities for parents to be able to be informed in first language is really, really key. And we do challenge schools to say, actually, you should have an interpreter. It's not the child's responsibility to interpret for the parent because one is a conflict of interest. You have you as an adult, as the practitioner, you have no idea what the child is interpreting back. Also, the parent has no idea what you're speaking about, and the child can really make up anything and everything in between that. And we've seen that.
They do that. They do that parents' evening.
We have witnessed it lots of times.
Where I admire the child's ingenuity, though, I have to say.
We have, and it's quite interesting because we had a meeting with a parent, and the child didn't know that the other worker that we had spoke his language, and he was just looking at me like. And I was like, okay. So we said to the teacher, actually, the communication is really, really key. And I think also what we always say to schools, it's important to understand some of the challenges and barriers that young people come with. So trauma, for example, is something that a lot of times is undealt with, and how that comes out in class, it might be completely different. So you might have one child who, just because they're from a similar area, they might be very docile, or they might be disengaged in the sense that they're just completely zoned out. Or you might have another child who is experiencing something similar, but they're acting out. And another challenge that we find as well is puberty. So when young children are going through puberty and they've had to deal with trauma, it's a really, really challenging time for them. And that's oftentimes when and then they're also transitioning from primary to secondary school. So all of those changes are happening. And then you have, in addition to that, instability of the immigration status, the pressures of poverty, or the pressures of dispersal. All those things do play an act into how children behave. And oftentimes it's not accounted for. So we always do explain to schools that, yes, you have right. Yes, you should have your behavior policy or whatever it is that you have. But within that behavior policy, you should have, space to be able to take into account some of the challenges that young people are dealing with, and then be able to address them as well. So not just, excluding them, because we do say to schools, you exclude a child, they're happy. They're not complaining. We've had boys who are happy to be excluded. They're like, that's fine. We don't have to come to school. So it is fine. It is being able to have communication with parents, but also for schools to be able to have space to be welcoming, but also have space to have that little space to be able to take into account some of the challenges young people are working with.
Yeah, I'd like to say it's also, I think schools need to be held responsible for that, because when a new child starts at the school, there is someone in charge of the admission process and the interview. Most students, families should have an interview, not to say like a job interview, you're going to pass or you're going to fail. It's an interview to get to know that family and to, find out what are the needs of this family. Okay, so we already have the application form, and there it will hopefully say, do you require translation, or try, and if you are in a school in an area, for example, let's just say Lambeth and Southwark, all schools should have application forms in Spanish and Portuguese. Okay, they should have them, in French, Somali, that they are the main languages spoken. But if you know that in the context of your area, that the majority of the families, or one of the most spoken languages is Spanish or Portuguese, have application forms in that home language, which we do at St Gabriel's, then when the child comes in for their interview. You know, get to know the families. You know, where do they come from? And that's where you need access to translators. I think all schools, I do this every single year. I do a language survey with the staff of the school, so I know exactly what staff speak what languages, and then at the end, are you happy to help me, you know, access, you know, a family, or, you know, translate, and then I have that bucket of knowledge where I know I can call upon, okay, it's not just the maths teacher, that maths teacher speaks Urdu, okay, the business manager, he speaks Farsi, so I can call on them on support, because EAL is a whole school. It should be a whole school ethos. It's not just the EAL department. Also, once you get to know that information from these families on the school system, we all have different school systems regardless of what school system it may be. I will have there in big, bold letters, home contact must be made in Spanish, home contact must be made in Portuguese, home contact must be made in French, and have these conversations with the staff as a whole. Okay, Google Translate is not great. We've got AI now. If you're going to send a message home to a family and it says home contact must be made in French, that message has to be in French. You can try and translate it, but we've got, you know, MFL in secondary schools. Go and speak to the French teacher. Does this message make sense? Well, I've got a bucket load of ready-made messages for parents, for teachers, that they can just go, okay, that's the message for positive message home, that's the message for, unfortunately, a detention, that's the message for, you know, attendance issues, that's the message for they did really fantastic in, I don't know, in a certain activity. So I do think it's a responsibility of the schools to get to know the students, especially when students are new arrivals. They come with a whole load of issues, you know, they might be living with their parents for the first time. You know, you need to know those kind of things, ask these questions and build what I call an EAL profile of that student. You know, have this on file so that, the whole school knows what, you know, information about this child, because a child could be really upset one day and crying in the corridor, and it might be the cleaner that comes across them. And if that cleaner knows that that child is a new arrival, then they can, you know, okay, let me just see, it's not just something. Or if you know that that child only speaks French and they're crying, let's go and find someone in one of the French teachers or one of the other members of staff that speaks French so that they can communicate with this child. It's not possible with the amount of languages that are spoken in secondary schools this day. But, you know, we have Google Translate. It's so much easier than when I was back at school. But I do think schools need to be held accountable for the way that we support our students.
Thank you so much, Claudia. We are just going to quickly wrap up. I'll welcome Bruna back to the front.
Right, I'll be very brief because we are over time. I guess that's actually a great sign of how productive this event has been. So just another big thank you to all of you for participating today. A big thank you to Karen as well, and a recognition of the brilliant work that she has done in this past year to bring us here. And I guess the common topic has been collaboration, right? We all agree that the challenges that we're facing are way too big for us to tackle by ourselves. And I hope the fact that so many of you have stayed up to, past 7, it's a really, really amazing sign of our willingness to continue to collaborate. And I hope we can build on these discussions, that you can take them back to your communities, take them back to your networks, know that IRMO is incredibly willing to continue to collaborate, and hopefully together we can actually make a difference on all these things that we care so deeply about. So thank you very much again. I hope you have a lovely and restful evening and that you can get some rest after so much that has been discussed today. Thank you. Thank you very much.